Okay, we should have. We did last night at our shir, but today we're gonna. Okay, but we'll continue to daven and our own, but we'll be learning in the merit of everyone in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so yesterday we had a machlokas. We had a Mishnah we had discussed the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and then we had two ways how to understand the machlokas. We had Rav Huna, who understood that there was a wall, right? We're talking about two homes, and two courtyards that open up into a well, and the well has a partition in it, over its different opinions, right? So there was the Tana Rabbi Yehuda who said that the wall was actually over the entire cistern, the entire well. We're going to come back to his view. But then we had Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both understood that it was within the well. Okay, the question was where. Rav Huna said that according to Beis Hillel, it was at the top of the well, above the water, and Beis Shammai was saying that it was at the lower, but still above the water. Those are the two views of Rav Huna. Rav Yehuda was of the opinion that it was in the water. Okay, and by the time we finished learning Rav Yehuda's view, we ended up seeing that Rav Yehuda understood that it wasn't just in the water, but Rav Yehuda's view is a more machmir view. He wasn't. It was actually his view was basically saying that the wall has to be going all the way from the beginning of the water to the end of the water. The question is, where do you have a wall or where do you have sticks? But according to both views, you need to have the partition within the water itself. Okay, both according to Beis Hillel and according to Beis Shammai. Right. So according to Rav Yehuda, you need to have an actual. According to Beis Shammai, it has to be like all the way through. According to Beis Hillel, it's not all the way through, but you're going to have a partition that goes into the water itself. You need to have some form of a partition in the water itself. Otherwise, it would not work. So clearly, again, Rabbi Yehuda is the more strict view, and he understands that in order for there to be carrying that's taking place from either well, there has to be like more of a full-fledged wall dividing the water itself, not just like an appearance of. Meaning, Rav Huna was clearly saying that there has to be an appearance of a partition in the water because the wall is not in the water at all, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rav Yehuda's view, to Rav Yehuda, the Mora, the wall has to be within the water itself. The water actually has to be divided in some way. According to Beis Shammai, all the way through. According to Beis Hillel, at least part of the water at the top has to have a full-fledged, real divider of the water. Now the Gemara is going to ask a question on that view of Rav Yehuda. So Ve'ela Hadam Rav Yehuda. Okay, we're going to have two statements in the name of Rav Yehuda. The first one we're not going to explain. It's not relevant to our Gemara. They are both just stated together. The first one is Korah Arba Materas Bechurba. We're talking about a wide open place, a churba, a ruin, and without walls, and you're only allowed to carry if there are actual walls. So the bottom line is you have a Korah, a beam which is 4 tefachim wide. There's a concept that the walls, even though there are no walls, if you have a roof alone, it's as if there are walls that go down. And so the bottom line is, again, not so relevant to it's not relevant to our discussion, but it's the first statement in the name of Yehuda that this 4 tefach beam allows you to carry under that beam because it's as if there are walls. Okay, that's just a lead up.
Yeah. You say months ago that you have the roof, yes, but you have to have something on the side. You can't just have a cover.
Not necessarily. It depends on different views. It depends on a number of circumstances. We're going to hold off on that view. Again, it's really just a build up to the next statement. Rav Nachman Amar. For us, obviously we could spend time on it. Rav Nachman Amar Ravua. Rav Nachman, name of Ravua says 86b1. This still in the view of Rabbi Yehuda, Korah Arba Materas B'mayim, that a Korah, a beam which is 4 tefachim wide, allows carrying between two courtyards. Okay. Now, you see the picture over there of what it looks like. Yeah, you see that. 4 tefach, right? It's the one picture on page 86b1. Basically, there's a well, and there's a beam on top of the well. That's it. It doesn't go into the well whatsoever. It's just on top of the well. Okay, ask the Gemara. Haka'azal delili idach gisa. Umaiti. But at the end of the day, the bucket goes to the other side of the Korah. Okay, sorry, one second. Yeah. Okay. So the bucket goes to the other side of the well. Umaiti, and a person's taking water from the other side, the other side of the water. Right. There's nothing. In other words, we saw until now, Rav Yehuda was of the view that you really need to have like a full-fledged partition blocking it from going from one side to the other. And here we see Rav Yehuda saying that no, even if you have a beam on top, which means it's not going into the water whatsoever, you're allowed to, even though that means that water is going to be drawn from either side. Right. This is inconsistent with Rabbi Yehuda's view. Until now, we've seen Rabbi Yehuda say, Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, you need to have something actually partitioning the water itself. And here he says, no, just a beam on top of the water is sufficient. How does that make sense? So ask the Gemara, Kim Lulur Bana.
Why is it a problem?
It's a contradiction. Because on the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion.
It's not in the water at all.
Correct. It's not in the water itself. And right, Rabbi Yehuda, meaning... We had a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, add 1 point just to understand why this is so compelling. In other words, the Mishnah says there is a wall above and below. Now, the simple read of above and below means it's above at the top of the pit, or below, a little bit lower, touching the water. Rav Huna is understood to be the pshat, the simple understanding. Rav Yehuda comes along and says, no, don't read it above mamish or below mamish. Don't like the simple read, but rather means like in the water, right? You have to be like lower in the water, which is not the simple read. What's compelling Rav Yehuda to do this, presumably, is because he holds that there's no way you're allowed to draw water because the water is being mixed underneath, right? So he's clearly has this view that you can't, that would be impossible, right? What's compelling him to interpret Beis Hillel Beis Shammai is clearly based on a view of his own, that you would not be able to be drawing water as long as the water is actually able to just like be openly flowing back and forth. Yet over here, he says clearly, you put a beam across and it's good. So the Gemara says no. The Chacham say, so the Gemara tries to answer this by saying that at the end of the day, the bucket is not going to, the bucket is going to drift and start pulling water from places, but the bucket's not going to go so far. And therefore the Gemara is saying that since we're talking about a beam that is 4 tefachim wide, and so a guy puts his bucket on one side, person puts a bucket on the other side, their buckets, right, they're drawing from other sides, their bucket's not going to go traverse the entire area past the beam. Okay, so the Gemara says fine, that covers that. However, tachas korah miyah arivimaya. At the end of the day, what about under the korah? So fine, you're telling me the bucket's not going to go to the other person's side, but there's the middle, which is shared space. And what do we know about shared space? Shared space is never allowed, right? So again, we have this contradiction in Rav Yehuda's view. Ella, the Gemara says, mishum dekalhu shekilu chacham b'mayim, because there's special leniency which the Chacham allowed for water. Okay, so what is Gemara saying over here? So there actually are some different ways how to read this Gemara, but the way Rashi understands the Gemara is retracting Rabbi Yehuda's view. The Gemara is saying Ella, whenever the Gemara says Ella, rather, that usually means that whatever we've understood earlier is incorrect. So we're saying Ella, there must be that there is a general leniency when it comes to water, and this view of Rabbi Yehuda we just mentioned over here about the beam is Rabbi Yehuda's legitimate view, and there are leniencies when it comes to water, and then we're therefore retracting Rabbi Yehuda's view earlier about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, dropping it by the side. In other words, really saying, you're right, there is a general leniency when it comes to water, okay? And therefore that interpretation of Beis Hillel Beis Shammai is incorrect, and and basically we're going to go like Rav Huna, who understands it doesn't have to actually, the wall doesn't have to go into the water, because when it comes to water, Chacham wanted to be lenient to allow a person to get water on Shabbos. This is a big necessity. We're dealing with rabbinic law, and therefore it was a leniency across the board, and we retract the earlier view of Rabbi Yehuda in his understanding of Beis Hillel Beis Shammai about where the wall has to be. Good? Fine. Says the Gemara, and the Gemara supports this. Minei Rav Tavla me Rav, as we saw, Rav Tavla asked Rav, mechitza tluya ma'al shetatir b'churba, can a suspended wall permit carrying in a ruin? In other words, let's say you have a home that opens into a ruin or something like that, and basically it's not really surrounded, but there are walls, but they're suspended walls, they're hanging walls, right? In other words, they don't reach the ground, they're hanging walls. So he says, Amrlei ein mechitza tluya materas el b'mayim. Hanging walls, suspended walls, only are a good wall when it comes to water. Kalu shekilu cham b'mayim. It's a special leniency that the Chacham allowed in regards to water. So bottom line is, everyone's agreeing that when it comes to drawing water, we are much more lenient. We don't look at the general rules of walls. We don't look at the general rules of really making a proper separation. Rather, we have a leniency, and this is the view of both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The question is, what's the extent of the leniency according to Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? But they both agree it's some form of a hanging wall, even though it's not going into the water, and that is the view of Rav Huna, and it's clearly now Rav Yehuda as well. Yeah. What about Lavud? Lavud's going to has to be actually close to the ground, within 3 tefachim. No, presumably not. Yeah. Okay. I'm Rav Yehuda. Also keep in mind, as the Gemara over here highlights, that even if you were to say that there is lavud, which I don't believe it would say, but there's going to be an issue, because even though there may be a wall, so if you're like carrying, but the problem is there's still going to be water that's traveling from side to side, and that means, like, again, if there's stuff coming from my neighbor's yard into my yard and back and forth, that would be problematic. So over here, we're clearly upping what we're typically going to allow.
So for lavud in general, if you have like a tree that's like going through it on a regular fence, lavud wouldn't apply.
You're saying
a bush that's on one lawn but grows in the other lawn,
and a wall and a fence that goes almost to the ground, and lavud takes the place. She's saying, would lavud work over there? I'm saying over here, I think it's even worse. Meaning, it's not just that the water is connected; it's like there's water that's going back and forth.
There's no partition whatsoever.
Correct. So we're saying it's stuff coming from your courtyard. I mean, if I take a ball and throw it into your courtyard, right? I can't do that. Over here, if I pull my bucket and my bucket's going to be drawing water from your yard, Meaning, if I reached over to your yard and took something, meaning even if it is a good partition, full-fledged partition, like with the tree, it'd be a full-fledged partition, let's say. Over here, it's as if I go into your yard, take something out of your yard, and bring it back to mine. That would be problematic. Okay.
The whole point here is that both parties are using this for their water needs on Shabbos. Right?
Correct.
That's the point.
That's the leniency.
So that's why it's lenient, because you need to use it.
Because you need water, so Chachamim basically relax their laws of their laws over here. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda, Lote Mechita. Okay, and Rav Yehuda comes along and he is of the most lenient opinion. We saw Beis Hillel Beis Shammai said the partition is in the well, right, within the lip of the well. However, Rav Yehuda said no, a regular wall above is going to act, meaning let's say you had a regular wall between two courtyards, and then then they find water, or they built it over the water, whatever it is, but it's just a regular wall which is above ground. So Amar Rabba Bar Barchana, Amar Rabba Bar Barchana, Amar Rav Yochanan, Rav Yehuda B'Shitas Rav Yossi Amra. Rav Yehuda said his ruling in accordance with the ruling of Rav Yossi. Okay, it's Amar who said Mechitza Tzliya Materas Afil Bi'Abasha. Rav Yossi is of the opinion that a hanging partition, which we just saw earlier, Rav said no, but Rav Yossi is of the opinion that a hanging partition works even on dry land. Nothing to do with water. It's a general leniency that a hanging partition does indeed work. Okay, and what's the source for this? It's not, we learned in the Mishnah, 86b2. Now we're talking about the laws of sukkah. Okay, so Mishnah in sukkah. A person wants to make a sukkah, and let's say they have the walls of they have like just poles, and then they build a wall coming from the roof, right, from the roof of their sukkah going down. Okay, it's 10 tvachim and it's going down. Bizman shigvos min ha'aretz shlosha tvachim psula. So the Tanakama says when it's above the ground more than 3 tvachim, because if it was within 3 tvachim it would be lavud, but if it's above 3 tvachim, then it's going to be invalid, right? Because above 3 tvachim, we don't consider that to be a wall. The reason the Gemara says is that, or the Mishnah says, I remember now, goats can walk in. In other words, you don't call that a wall. If you have a high wall and anyone could come in, or like little animals could come in, that's not a wall, right? So, however, if it's within 3 tvachim, we'd be fine. Milmata lamala, if it's 10 tvachim from the bottom, if it's 10 tvachim and higher, the sukkah is valid. Which, by the way, is important halacha to know about sukkahs. Sometimes you have porches, people come and they say, what do I have to add to the porch to make it? You're good. Your porch, most porches are 10 tvachim high, I would hope, right? Or else you have other issues, because then you have a makkah issue, you have to have a wall. So your porch is 10 tvachim high. And so if you put a pole, once you have those porch walls, and you put schach on top, you're good to go. It's totally kosher, because you have walls, right? Those are good walls. Ideally, they say you should still add a little bit there, but strictly speaking, those walls would be completely kosher walls. Okay, but that's not our focus today. Our focus is the other way. The Tanakhama says, even if it's 10 tvachim, if it's higher than 3 tvachim from the ground, it's not going to be a good wall. However, Rav Yossi Omer, Kishem Shemilamat Lamala Asara, just as a wall from the bottom upwards is valid if it's 10 tvachim or higher, if it's 10 tvachim high, Kach Milamala Lamata Asara, so too, if you have a wall that's 10 tvachim from the schach, you have a wall that starts going down, right? Then it's going to be kosher, even though it's more than 3 tvachim off the ground. Okay? He holds that a hanging partition is a good wall. So the Gemara wants to say that Rav Yehuda in our Mishnah, who said that this wall that goes above the well, right, it's just standing above ground, is a good wall. It's the same view of Rav Yossi. Just like Rav Yossi says that a hanging partition goes all the way down, here too. It goes above the well, but we treat it as if it goes all the way down. Okay, that would seem to be the same view. The Gemara says Velohi, but no, it's actually a bad association. They're not connected. Why? Lo Rav Yehuda several like Rav Yossi. Rav Yehuda does not hold like Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi several like Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yossi does not hold like Rav Yehuda. Why? Rav Yehuda lo several like Rav Yossi. Rav Yehuda, who said his law by the well in our Mishnah, he does not hold like Rav Yossi. Why? Ad kan lo kam Rav Yehuda ella be'eruve chatzeres drabanan. Maybe Rav Yehuda only said his halacha here in the Masechus Eruvin, which is entirely rabbinic, right? But when it comes to aval sukkah d'oraisa lo, when it comes to making a sukkah is a biblical law. So maybe he would say, no, a hanging partition in a sukkah, that's already biblical. Maybe I'm not going to mess over there. Maybe I would say you need a full-fledged wall. We don't know that Rav Yehuda, who says his law over here by Eruvin, is going to say his law by sukkah. And the flip side, Rav Yossi said like Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yossi who said his law in Masechah Sukkah, maybe he doesn't say the same thing. Maybe he doesn't agree with Rav Yehuda. Why? Ad kan lo kamar Rav Yossi ela b'sukkah de isra asehu. Maybe Rav Yossi only said his halacha because it's a positive mitzvah, which although it's biblical, in some respects it's lighter. Aval Shabbos, regarding our halachos, Eruvin, although it's rabbinic, but it's a law regarding Shabbos, disra skilahu, which is ultimately, Shabbos laws in general are going to be punishable by skila, okay, by stoning. And therefore, maybe he never said so. What?
What's the punishment in the sukkah case?
What's the?
Sukkah?
It's a positive mitzvah. You at the very most you would get makos if well, no, you wouldn't even get makos. That would be a durban. Sorry, nothing. There'd be no. It's a bit laseh. Right. So you see, fine, bottom line is the two opinions don't align. Yes, they say similar things, but one is saying in my Maseches Sukkah, one is saying Maseches Eruvin, and the two don't necessarily mix. Okay. Vim Tomar, asked the Gemara, Osa Maisa Shnasa b'Tzipori. There was a story which happened in Tzipori. Okay. Alpi Minasa. By whose authority was this done? Okay, what's the question? Tzipori was the location where Yossi was the rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of Tzipori, and there was a story. The Gemara is going to tell us the story in a moment, where carrying was done with hanging partitions, and the Gemara and carrying is a Shabbos law. Okay, Rav Yossi was talking about Sukkah. Right? Let's review. Rav Yossi said his law by Sukkah. And we said, it's the same thing as the laws by Eruvin. The Gemara said, no. Eruvin l'chud, Sukkah l'chud. They're two totally separate things. Maybe there's one set of halachos by Eruvin, one set of halachos by Sukkah. Don't mix the two together. The Gemara says, wait a second. We have a case in Rav Yossi's location, where they're going to be providing a leniency with hanging partitions in the laws of Shabbos. So we see clearly that Rav Yossi does rule. Rav Yossi does rule that hanging partitions are going to be something that he holds of, even when it comes to the laws of Shabbos. You with me? Yeah. So let's see the story. So before we see the story, the Gemara says, "Lo pi Rav Yossi." It wasn't Rav Yossi. Ella al pi Rav Yishmael bi Rav Yossi nasa. Rav Yossi eventually passed away, and who took over? His son Rav Yishmael. So Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, had an opinion which was actually more alike to Rav Yehuda the Tana, not his father. In other words, there's no contradiction, or there's no question at least. The Gemara was right in distinguishing between Rav Yossi and Rav Yehuda. The one who paskined in the case of Tzipori was Rav Yossi. It was his successor, his son, Rav Yishmael Rav Yossi, and at least therefore the Gemara's answer remains. Okay, what was the story? Says the Gemara, Dechi Asa Rav Dimi Amar, Rav Dimi, when he came from Israel, told the following story. There was a scenario where there was no Erev in a city, in Tzipori, and they forgot to bring the Sefer Torah to Shul. It's Shabbos morning, and they open the Aron, and it's empty. Right? Oh, right, we had a Shiva house. We brought it over there. We have no Sefer Torah here. So what do? Lamachar parsu sadna lamudim. The next day, they spread linen sheets on posts. Okay, and they brought the Torah scroll and to read from it. Now, the Gemara is the Gemara is telling us that the sheets did not actually reach the ground. They were sheets hanging up high. They're above 3 tvachim from the ground. 3 tvachim is not very high. They were sheets that were hanging, and they were 3 tvachim above the ground, and yet they treated these as full-fledged walls. They carried through it on Shabbos. And again, this is a story in Tzipori. So the Gemara first initially thought it was Rav Yossi. You're saying Rav Yishmael, Rav Yossi, no contradiction. But that's the story. Ask the Gemara, wait, Parsu? Lechatchil Mishar, you're allowed to form partitions on Shabbos? 86b3. Vaha kol modim shein osim ola rai b'Shabbos. Everyone agrees you're not allowed to make a temporary structure on Shabbos. Now, this is a very interesting question, because normally we assume that an ohel arai, a temporary structure, normally we think involves a covering. Over here, we're dealing with just a wall. So let's distinguish. So as we discussed and repeats in my my little pet peeve. Sorry?
It's a covering in some way.
It's a covering in some way. It doesn't go over the top. So there is a distinction that has to be made. So when it comes to ohel arai, right, making tents on Shabbos is Aser. Sorry, I'm like the killjoy over here, okay? But the bottom line is that making those tents, which is like minhag Yisrael, it's like one of such a standard practice in all houses on Shabbos, is really Aser. You can't do it on Shabbos. Again, it's like, to stone your kids. But the bottom line is, certainly adults should not get involved, and as the kids get older, they should know they should avoid this. Not little kids, whatever. Use your intelligent judgment. But the bottom line is that this is to make a full-fledged tent on Shabbos. A partition, there is a distinction. A partition, if it's a partition which is needed to make a full-fledged halachic distinction, makes a full-fledged halacha rishus, then that would not be allowed as a wall. So when it comes to, the halachos that are mentioned are halachos like this. If you're making a domain, that's already halacha. There actually are halachos also if a person needs to, there's a halacha about, it's forbidden for a person to be intimate with their spouse in front of Sfarim, because it's all seen as the same room. So to put up a wall is actually seen as a, so let's say a person allowed to do is put up a sheet like on top of Sfarim, then that would be problematic, because that's really making a separate domain. But otherwise, in our show, back in the day, we used to have half rentals. Nothing drove me more crazy. But basically we had these half rentals. So the people would rent out and have these like fancy schmancy bar mitzvah, and we'd be like stuffed into like the corner. Like we'd have like a third of the room, and we'd be like eating like nothing. But whatever. But they would put up a wall sometimes, and that wall is allowed. It's a temporary wall. right? That's a temporary wall, and that's allowed because it's a temporary wall, and it's just a wall. It's not a halachic mechitza. It's just like a partition so that you don't, there's no, nothing happening. You're not taking their sushi, whatever it is. But it's not a halachic wall, okay? But over here, it's a halachic wall. Over here, it's a halachic wall, and therefore the Gemara asks, how's that allowed? The Gemara says, "Eno elamatzu sedin and prusim alamudim." They found sheets which are already spread on posts from before Shabbos. In other words, they happened to find a corridor where there was, people were hanging their laundry. Women, people were hanging. There's the laundry lines, between the shul and the house where there was the Sefer Torah. So there were sheets already hanging. That's where they're able to carry between it. Okay, and therefore ve'viu Sefer Torah v'karbo. They brought the Sefer Torah. But the bottom line is, okay, now the bottom line is the story was where they on Shabbos they don't have the Sefer Torah, but the house that has the Sefer Torah is connected to the shul with sheets which are hanging above 3 tvachim. Okay, and so they rely on those walls. But who is the one who paskin that it's okay? It's Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yossi, and now Rabbi Yossi himself. Rabbi Yossi himself maybe only says the halachos by sukkah. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi says the law is even by Shabbos, which is in line with the law of Rabbi Yehuda, the view of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. We will pick up, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.